Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Bad Guys from 2022. This is a movie that I was curious about when it first came out. I actually thought it was older than it is, weirdly. That's unusual. And is one that I've heard quite a few people talk about every now and then, usually not with like wide oh yeah, I also love that film, but usually, people who regularly have good takes, and so it's always been a curiosity for me, but something I've never gotten around to watching. It's another in a long line of children's animated films coming out of one of the big couple of animation studios, in this case DreamWorks. I actually thought that this was a Sony movie, but we'll get to why I thought that in a little bit. This is not as good a film as I wanted it to be. And the problem is, the more I think about it, the less good it is. But it is not a bad film by any means. I want to put that forth first and foremost. This movie is a lot of things. But ultimately, to me, it's a little confused. It seems a little confused. And I don't know whether that happened, what stage in the production that happened in, whether it was in the writing stage or the production stage or the editing stage. And because it's animated as well, that raises other questions about what order things were done in. And it was also done during the pandemic, or recorded during the pandemic. So, you had sort of a disjointed production process. None of that really excuses what ultimately turns out. It's just more of an explanation. And I have a lot of curiosity because of what this movie ultimately proves to be. Now, at its core, it's about a couple of anthropomorphic animal characters who are the bad guys. That's literally their in-world moniker. Who commit crimes. And this is immediately right off the bat where we start running into some weird questions for me. I did not realize, because I had not seen anything prior to this basically about it, what the world they were going to be in was. And the answer is weird. The answer is they are anthropomorphic animals in normal human LA. I don't think they call it LA, but it is LA. And they concede that right off the bat, because the very first scene, the public reaction of all these, like, it hits you first, oh, those are human beings. And they are like shocked and surprised to see these anthropomorphic animals. That sets a certain tone, at least for me, as a movie watcher and as somebody who has watched a variety of kids films and a variety of films in general, and who thinks a lot about the kind of world building you can and can't do when you make certain choices like that. So you would think if what the very first scene includes is, oh no, it's literally the big bad wolf in human world, that it's going to go a certain way. Now, this is not what I expected in the first place, because what I expected was a world that was full of entirely animals, much like Zootopia. We'll put a pin in Zootopia. We'll come back to that. But it doesn't go that way. For some reason. Don't really know why, but those are the choices they made. So they've put it in a human world. Okay, so what's the concession going to be there? Is it going to be, the whole setup is that they are, for some reason, anthropomorphic speaking animals in a human world? No, actually, all of the main characters, well, okay, not all, a bunch of the main characters are anthropomorphic animals. Um, but for some reason, almost everyone else is a human. That's weird enough. It gets weirder because there are normal animals as well that are not anthropomorphic, that do not speak, that do not have human intelligence. They are just normal animals. And they are not minor either. This isn't like, oh, you see a cat or a dog being walked or something. No, they are normal animals are critical to elements of of the plot, and that raises some the usual questions, which I'm not going to dig into too much because I think you should probably be aware what they are. The one we always go back to is Goofy and Pluto, of like, hey, is this okay? This seems morally dubious at best. But they gloss over that as well. Now they do start to talk about why the characters are the way they are. And I suppose it could be considered a spoiler. I don't really think it is, to say that that is never resolved. And that's a shame, because I think that is kind of the strongest and most interesting thing the movie possibly has going for it. The right off the bat concession is these are the bad guys, and they are known as the bad guys because they literally, like, they don't say it in so many words because this is a kid's film, but they have no place in society because everybody reacts to them weird. Which again goes back to this weirdness of having talking animals in a human world. Because there are other talking animals who are accepted. But we'll gloss over the these ones are bad for some reason issue and get further into the whole failure to really address that, which is a shame because it is the moral arc of the story. I've talked about previously how most movies made for a younger audience are intending to tell some sort of moral story, similar to what I was previously talking about in the last few weeks about Westerns, but for different reasons. But kids' films tend to have a clear, this is how you should behave, this is not how you should behave kind of narrative. And in more recent times, there has been a greater diversity and greater development in those kinds of stories in terms of saying, being encouraging of kids and of creativity and of different ways of thinking, rather than being the sort of moral crusades of an earlier era of children's film, let's say. And this almost does that. It starts to do it, at least. It sets itself up to say, I think, and it doesn't get very far, so I'm kind of giving it maybe more credit than it should have. It starts to say, these are villainous characters. This is a spider, a wolf, a piranha, a snake, and a shark. These are all types of animals that are typically maligned in pop culture in general. Like, people don't like them. They're scared of them for whatever reason. Whether or not you actually have any reason to be fearful of these kinds of animals, these are the kinds of animals that typically get painted in a bad light in pop culture in general, let alone in, being literal sapient beings. And that's a really interesting in-world setup and concession to make of, yes, the whole reason they've gone to be bad, so the bad guys, is because they're discriminated against and they can't find any way to be accepted. So they might as well just lean into it and be the bad guys and live the best life they can outside of the society that doesn't accept them. This is never resolved. Spoilers. I'm not really spoilers because they just don't do anything with it. The arc of the thing starts to give you messages of if you give people opportunities and a place that they can to be accepted, that they like there's nothing inherently bad about anyone and everybody can learn to be better. But then it gets bogged down in its own plot way too much, which is weird to say because I'm going to pack up and talk about the very beginning of the film again. The other thing that struck me right at the beginning of this film, and what part of what made me say that thing at the beginning of this is a very confused film, is that this film does not seem to have a good sense of the age demographic it wants to target, at least not to my mind. I'm not in the age demographic they're targeting, but again, I think there's a lot of sort of common sense stuff here. The immediate tip-off for me, at least in small part, was the way that the first few minutes is edited. It is very, very fast. It very much, maybe this is the old person in me speaking out too much, but to me, it is very like child has no attention span editing. And that is extra weird because this movie clearly takes animation inspiration from the animated Spider-Man films in terms of its style. It uses these sort of mixed styles and mixed frame rates and these other things that are very much a hallmark of those two movies, and seems to be pretty unabashed about that. And that's fine. But there's a difference in the editing, for sure. And so those first few minutes are at an absolute breakneck pace. Now, yes, in World, the reason for that is there's a car chase. Okay, fair enough. But that doesn't mean that the whole editing needs to be... it's probably going to be a bitch to edit. I shouldn't have done that. It's just cut. It hurts my eyes to watch. And that's a shame because there's actually a lot of really good animation work going on in this movie. And it does not swing back that severely too much in the film. It does go very fast at times and it does overcut at times. But largely like that's just the particular kind of thing. The other thing is some of the things that they do and don't include in the script tipped me off right off the bat that this seemed to be targeted at a very young audience. I'm going to say preteens, somewhere between 8 and 12 years old. And that's weird because I had that thought going through the rest of the film and constantly considering, okay, who's this writing appropriate for? Who is this plot pacing appropriate for? How much, as we've talked about before with other kids' films, is this editing and pacing done specifically because of an attention span targeting issue? And I could never shake the idea that a lot of that was dictated by an assumption of a certain very young demographic who was not going to have the attention span or interest or presumption of lack of narrative processing, let's say, to follow a complex narrative or to be patient as things are unveiled. And that is what's particularly difficult for this as a heist film. This is a, heist style film that takes its influences very clearly from a lot of things in the 70s, 80s, 90s, especially things like Ocean's 11. We'll get back to Ocean's 11 as well. Don't worry. So I could not help thinking that the entire time I was watching. Meanwhile, I was also thinking that narratively speaking, this is a film that would work. This is a plot that would be more appropriate if targeted for a slightly older audience. That's not to say that it doesn't work for a younger audience, but especially if your assumption when you are choosing how and what to write is that your audience has a low attention span and doesn't care as much about structure or a narrative arc, then they should have simplified the narrative. Because overall, this is actually a pretty complex narrative in the film, at least in terms of the mysteries and the elements of the heist. So it sets itself up to kind of be disappointing because it leaps for some higher bars and then does the absolute bare minimum to finish what it started. I don't know how to explain that better. It's trying to do a complex narrative with a heist hijinks that involve multiple parties doing multiple things simultaneously, and yet refuses to extrapolate upon what everyone's doing sufficiently for those actions to be compelling. They are more there because they are hallmarks of the genre than they are actually necessary for the plot to work. It would be a much better choice for this presumed target audience to use the same tropes, but to simplify the overall narrative. And I'm even curious if somebody of the presumed target age demographic would even be able to follow some of the complexities of the sort of multi-scene events going on. This is not something, this is not me underestimating kids at all. This is really me thinking that if they don't think the target audience can follow a more complex plot without them just, barking nonsense to pretend like it's like the narrative is meaningful, then why would they also assume that you can have like 3-4 different parties working in different rooms simultaneously and you're going to hard cut between them really fast and everything's you're going to understand the synergy of a heist? That seems like an assumption that isn't going to work. Now this gets into me inevitably having to compare it to other things as I was watching it. And in fact, the first thing I thought of while watching it was not Zootopia. The first thing I thought of was Megamind. Because Megamind is not an incredible film, but it's pretty good. And in a lot of ways, I think it manages to be successful at a lot of the things that this movie sort of fumbles. It is a better contained narrative that better adapts adult tropes to a young audience, and delivers those things in a satisfying narrative arc. There's a couple other movies that I thought about as well, and all of these movies I think are better for various reasons. And I could delve really deeply into the specifics, but I'm going to mostly avoid it. Another that I thought about was Despicable Me, which, Lord, I fucking hate Minions, but Despicable Me is a pretty good film, and it is targeted at a very young audience. And especially if they would just remove the fucking Minions, it is a very good adaptation of a genre that doesn't necessarily make sense for kids, but adapts it very well for a childlike attention and for childish themes. The idea that, spoilers for Despicable Me, they're gonna steal the moon is way more entertaining for a kid than the idea that the bad guys are gonna steal things that aren't the moon, basically. So I couldn't help thinking about Despicable Me being a more interesting and more child-friendly heist caper superhero supervillain type of thing. And then there's Zootopia, which I think again is more targeted at that slightly older audience that I think this movie should be targeting. And in fact, I could not ever at any point shake the feeling that, man, if the team that made Zootopia had bought this script and worked it into the Zootopia universe, that could have been a very good way of expanding that franchise and diversifying that IP so that you can make more interesting stories to tell in that Zootopia world. I don't remember if I've talked about Zootopia specifically before. For all I know, I've made a video about it and forgotten. But one of the things I think that Zootopia does really, really well is its world building. Like, it is shockingly good at world building. A very believable world that makes sense, makes the narrative concessions where it needs to make its world make sense, and builds a narrative around its world in a very natural way. Comparatively, this movie, which is like its arc could easily have fit into the Zootopia universe, when Zootopia is in part about this dichotomy between predators and prey. The whole narrative of the bad guys about like not having their place because they're all like creepy, weird animals, or however you want to put it, fits perfectly into that universe. And I don't know what exactly happened in terms of this being shopped around, and obviously Disney and DreamWorks have forever been and probably will forever be at opposite sides of a fight that will never end in terms of their studios. But something tells me it probably passed by Disney at some point. And even if they didn't go to Disney, then the bad guys could have taken a lot of notes from Zootopia, just crib the whole universe, just steal their whole thing, in order to make a narrative that makes more sense. So unfortunately, Zootopia ends up beating it in a lot of ways too, while also being, I think, more appropriately targeted for the age demographic that's appropriate for the script as written, I guess. And then there's like a couple of other things. Obviously, I could talk about Turning Red, which I'm going to continue talking about because I still think it's an extraordinary film for kids about really important topics, and it does, even without any specific topic in mind, it is like the peak in my mind right now in terms of addressing issues that kids really deal with in a way that does not talk down to kids and acknowledges their feelings and acknowledges their emotions and tries to be supportive rather than preachy. And again, the bad guys ultimately doesn't even meet that standard because it doesn't even really conclude that arc of its narrative or whatever. It really feels to me like that might be the sort of thing that makes me believe most that this was originally targeted at a slightly older audience, like tweens and early teens, but ended up getting bits of its script cut or reworked too much to target a younger audience. Because I don't know how else they could have written that narrative and had it just drop. So ultimately it does all these things. It does them pretty well, but ultimately it doesn't do them as well as a bunch of other movies that have come out over the last 15 years. That said, with all that criticism, let me talk about all the things that this movie does do really well, which I think it does do a lot of things very well. I already mentioned that I think that a lot of the animation is very good. Some of the editing is a little rough around the edges. Some of the choices in cinematography, I think, are a little bit too aggressive and are also hampered by the editing as well, where they're trying to go a little too crazy with the shots they want to take, and it's a little bit hard to follow and even lessens the spectacle of some of the scenes that it renders, which is a shame because it's got some great fun set pieces that are very appropriate to a sort of bombastic heist, which is a lot of fun. A lot of the production in general is also very good. I think the music is generally pretty good. It's a little on the nose sometimes, but it's a kid's film. And the overall design elements that go into the character designs in particular are very good. Now, how they fit into their world when the world is a mostly human world, are mostly mediocre. There are a few bits and pieces here where it's like, oh, they added like a little set of stairs for that small character or something like that, that make some of those world building concessions, but again, like are pale in comparison in the world building to something like Zootopia. It's just the inevitable comparison that's always going to be made. I'm not the first one to make it. There are also a lot of other things in the casting that I think are very good. The cast overall is very talented. I think they all put on really great performances. The one thing that I cannot shake is that Wolf, the main character, is played by Sam Rockwell, who is a very good actor in his own right, who I think I've talked about on a couple of occasions before. Good actor, good voice actor. Can't shake the fact that he is doing a George Clooney impression. Like, to be fair, the two of their voices are not that far off, but if you have watched Ocean's 11 or the Ocean's remakes, let's say, with George Clooney, or anything else with George Clooney in a similar role to that, because he's done quite a few things, you recognize the cadence and some of the markers of his speech that are a little too similar to not have been an intentional choice. Now, whether Rockwell sort of put those in himself or whether he was directed, I'm going to assume it was a direction given to him at some point. But that's a little bit distracting, knowing that it's Sam Rockwell and just wishing that he was being more Sam Rockwell, because Sam Rockwell is great. But, you know, it's neither here nor there. It's still a good performance. To that point, I think there's also a decent amount going on here for an older audience. This is not solely, despite being targeted at that very young audience, this is not without its merits for an older audience. And in a relatively good way, makes use of the tropes and the cinematic knowledge of an older generation and all these other references that are not super overt. It's hardly the best I've ever seen this done. I've talked about this before, how lots of kids' films throw in lots of jokes and sight gags and things that are only for adults. This does a lot of them pretty well. Not amazing, but like not in an irritating, oh, here's this just for you kind of way, which is the opposite end of the spectrum. It's pretty okay. Like I said, the plot overall is very thin. I really didn't talk about the plot, did I? I guess let me put a pin in that and come back to the plot, because we'll sort of close out with that. I think that most of the other things around this are pretty solid. I would be curious. Apparently, there is a sequel in the works, supposedly coming out next year. Who knows if that's true? This is good enough that I'd still be curious about it. The plot has. I got so into the narrative not really working and getting too distracted and not really telling the story it was trying to tell that I sort of forgot to dig into the problems with the plot and pacing as much. The plot's real thin, despite being very complex, because they set up a bunch of little things to sort of show a narrative arc for these characters, but it is played so thinly and with such poor pacing that it drops the ball in terms of being satisfying. This the overall structure of the film really needed. I am not that much of a stickler for the sort of 3-act framework of films, but especially when it comes to films that are aping a certain genre, and especially for films for a younger audience. Following the 3-act structure really carefully is a good way to ensure not too much confusion. But again, in a mistake that I think may be in part due to sloppy editing of the script and because all of that because of this younger target audience, what you get is a very long lead up, a very long setup, probably a half an hour, of who the characters are and what they're like, without saying too much, really, unfortunately. Then a relatively brief arc in which they seem to have really the most minor of character development, that instead of being good and entertaining and meaningful in its own right, instead is a narrative beat in order to set up the next arc of wild and crazy events, I guess. And so what you have is a little bit, and then that sort of comes to a crest, and then there's another turn, another setback, and then another crest. And none of these build to each other very well, which I think is really important for a kid's film. What you basically have is 3 arcs, none of which are very satisfying, none of which are very well paced or spaced. And all of which sort of end up undermining what they initially set up a little bit. But for again, my assumption is they probably did that because they felt the need to keep a kind of constant breakneck pace for the audience that they were targeting. They didn't probably want to sit around, even though I definitely think they should have, even for this audience. They didn't sit around and give the proper middle section arc of the characters sort of having their growth periods. It just went straight into multiple iterations of kind of the same, but you're here for the shiny, flashy lights. Like, not to be too dismissive or rude about that in my phrasing, but that's sort of, I think, what Hollywood assumes little kids want to see. They're not entirely wrong, but like, let's, expect better of them. So it really falls apart in the plotting, and is ultimately unsatisfying. And that also leads into more crippling of the moral aspect of it, the lesson that I talked about at the beginning. I don't remember if there's anything else that I specifically wanted to point out. There probably was, but I've already sort of rambled about this one longer than I thought. It's interesting. I like it in a bunch of ways. Unfortunately, I think there's a bunch of movies that came before it that does the things that it does better. So if you're wondering if this is a good film, it's fine. But go watch Zootopia and Despicable Me and Megamind and Turning Red first. And then if you still want something kind of in the similar vein, this is not bad. Anyway, thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. I've been your host, the Social Solipsist, and I'll see you guys next time.